This is a Hope 1032 podcast.
Hello, welcome to Undistracted. I'm your host, Laura Bennett, and this is the podcast where we learn from our guests how to be better at building our lives with intention around our passions, our purpose, and dealing with some of the stuff that can get in the way of that. And apologies for getting this episode to you later than expected. Full disclosure, I've been working on some other podcast projects and stories. I ended up overseas for a quick minute, but here we are today, so thank you so much for waiting. Our guest this week is author, educator and actress Zoe Coyle. From Farscape to Prime Suspect and All Saints, Zoe stepped into the stories of many different characters, but it's one in her new book, The Dangers of Female Provocation, that frames our conversation today. Now, first things first, the book is for mature audiences. It deals with themes around marriage, trauma, betrayal and intimacy that won't be for everybody, but at its heart is the story of a woman named Odessa who's dealing with the realities of fear, anger and uncertainty that give us a way into our own experiences, into conversations around the role of rage in civilized society and how good people can find themselves doing bad things. Zoe also speaks about the evolution of friendships, the benefit of regret, and how to accept change. Let's welcome Zoe to the show.
Thank you for having me.
This book, I mean, it's something that comes out of, I suppose, a love for writing for you. But when I look at your career, you've gone from acting, there's communication coaching in there as well, and this aspect of writing. Is there a through line in those for you?
Yeah, look, I think there is. I mean, my company, Pilot Light, that I still work in, I work in wholehearted leadership and I teach emotional intelligence and I speak to school groups about things like gender and patriarchy and feminism and courage. So look, all those things that I'm really interested in as a human being and in my workspace and as a mother and a wife and a friend, they all get distilled down into the novels that I write for sure.
And what drives your interest in those particular subjects?
I think it's what makes us a human being. All the behaviors and ideas and feelings and thoughts that allow us to connect to ourselves and other people. So that's what I'm really interested in. I really like human beings and I'm big on connection. So, I mean, I think it's sort of one of my core drivers in life. It's why I've had 1,000 children and I take my friendships very seriously. So I'm really interested in what people do, particularly for love, how far they'll go for love. You probably guess I'm a hopeless romantic. I've been with my husband since I was 18 and I think I said to him on the first date, which nearly sent him running for the hills, I think I said to him, the kind of love where someone would die for me. And he told me a couple of months later that he nearly packed his bags right then and there.
Yeah, as you can imagine though. But I think it's interesting then, like given you've got this romantic core, that the ideas of pushing back on patriarchy and this kind of justice touch that seems to go within that story for you and then also in the story of your book as well. Where does the justice interest come into that conversation for you?
That's such a great question. So I am also fundamentally interested in fairness. And I think, and obviously I'm speaking to you as a white, middle-class, educated woman, so I'm also mindful of my own privilege. But when I go into different types of communities or organizations, say in Australia or wherever else I work, I'm aware that the playing field is not level. That life for, and of course I'm making generalizations here and I know that generalization is a blunt tool, but when I go into organizations that, are crowded with white middle-class men, their reality is very different to when I'm working with female refugees. And that, I find it outrageous that for some people life is so much harder and for some people it's just on a platter. And for me, I've got 2 daughters and 2 sons. So, and I've got 3 elder brothers, and I used to have a very alpha dad. I was very interested in feminist thinking from very early on. My mother was British and not particularly sort of thought that those ideas were a bit controversial, and you should just get along with everyone and not talk too much about that stuff. But as I've got older, the objectification that I experienced as a teen and then looking at it happening to my daughters. My daughters getting grabbed on buses, or like last night, I was walking with my 14-year-old. She's very tall. She's 6'1", and she was in her school uniform. I was picking her up from tutoring, and a car full of men, men in their 30s, were hollering and screaming at her. And I was right beside her, and I just thought, isn't that fascinating that still happens? So I wanted to explore that. And I'm not saying that all men are bad. I love men. I'm married to one. My favorite person is a man. But I just wanted to explore that idea of how are men created like that, and what is the reality for women experiencing a world like that.
And when you write a book called The Dangers of Female Provocation, that's already going to be a title that has some people going, oh, what's this going to be about? Is this one of those sort of quote-unquote angry women stories? And even that thinking, right? The fact that people would view it like that says that there is something inherently uncomfortable when we talk about female rage or even female passion or just that tenacity. People can be so uncomfortable by that, or made uncomfortable by that.
Totally. And look, I hope obviously it doesn't keep people outside the book. I know quite a few of my male friends, and look, I got some of my dearest male friends to read the book before publication, because it was very important to me that it wasn't just a feminist rant, or that it was a patriarchal rant, or that it was a book against men, because I don't feel like that at all. I feel like everybody has to come to the conversation, to everyone's welcome at the table. But look, I think female rage is really a fascinating topic. For me, I was pretty much totally disenfranchised from my anger until I was in my 30s, because it had been explicitly said, but also it was just implied by my school and my family. And once again, another generalization, but as women, I think where it makes people uncomfortable, and we've been told that our anger is ugly or shrewish or hysterical or out of control, whereas men are allowed a little more anger, and to express it, because that's considered manly, but men are disallowed, and again, generalization, disallowed emotions that we would consider feminine, which is ridiculous because emotions aren't gendered, like fear or grief or sadness.
And what drives the anger, at least in the context of this book, for the main character Odessa Odin, is legitimate stuff, right? It's not. It's founded in moral issues and betrayal and all of these sorts of things. Set up the story of Odessa for us. Who is she, and sort of what circumstances does she find herself in?
I will. So her name is Odessa Odin, and she's in her late 30s. She's 38, and she's living in London, an incredibly privileged, powerful, and closeted life. She has a very dear group of sisters, so, a community of friends that she feels is sisterhood. And then through some experience that Odessa has, namely the death of her father and finding out that her husband is having an affair, it drops an atomic bomb, or detonates an atomic bomb within Odessa. And it changes the way she looks at her world and her life. And so she makes a reassessment about all sorts of things that she thought made perfect sense to her before, like her relationship to her affluence. But the other thing is she looks at her sisterhood's husbands and then thinks that they are not loving her sisters as well or as deeply, as honestly as they should. So she takes it on board herself to re-educate them using every and all means possible. So I very much did not want to write a book about a crazy woman. That trope just bores me. I think we've had enough of that. I wanted to write about a woman who is furious, and she's been suppressing her rage into resentment for years. And then it bursts out, and it's probably a little misplaced. It probably should have been delivered to her husband, but instead it gets spewed out over all these men. And in that process, she sets alight a lot of lives, including her own.
Yeah, it's a very, very full kind of story. And it's interesting to me, the dynamic of how she decides to not just try and correct and address her own circumstance, but also look to that of her friends and their relationships. Do you think there's, I suppose, is that a positive thing or a negative thing? That characteristic we may relate to of, I don't just want to fix me, but I want to fix you too.
Yeah, I mean, look, I love Odessa, but I'd say there's a touch of narcissism there. I mean, I think I say that that's too judgy, that term. I think she's in so much pain that she doesn't know how to hold the pain. And so she transmogrifies it she justifies it, this idea that I am going to harness this pain and I'm going to create good of it. And how I can do that is I can't save my own marriage. That's a disaster. But I can help my friends' marriages. Look, it's not thinking that I would ascribe to. I think my belief is you support your friends' marriages, but you stay out of them. But I also think that it's fairly sacred and deeply private, a marriage. So I think you stay out of it. But Odessa, because of the trauma she's experienced and because she has control freak tendencies and the nature of her personality and her upbringing, that she actually manages to justify what I and maybe you would consider pretty unjustifiable.
And as a writer, how do you come up with those kind of characters and the full identity of a person like Odessa?
Well, I think being an actor originally helps with that, because I was trained, when I went to night, I was trained to think a lot about character and flesh out character. I'm also a huge consumer of podcasts and books and films, so I love storytelling. And then it goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, that I'm just intrinsically interested in people. So fleshing out a character is a deep joy. Odessa in the beginning was much more severe and scary, and then it was that process of as I got to know her better through the writing, softening, and hopefully then making her much more nuanced. I wanted to, because part of the thing I wanted to look at in this book is perception, that we perceive people to be a certain way, and then when we learn facts about them or we integrate with them more intimately, they can be a very different kettle of fish to our perception. And certainly one of the male characters, whose name I won't use because I don't want it to be a spoiler, in the beginning we're introduced to him through Odessa's gaze, and he comes off the page not very well. But actually, as the book evolves, hopefully he becomes more complex and more beautiful and nuanced. And he's actually an exceedingly beautiful person. He's just in pain, and she brought to bear her own judgments of him, which were ill-informed.
And when you look at the journey that Odessa goes on, I feel like it's representative of something that can happen for a lot of the people that read this book or, relate to it in any way, of the changing stages throughout life, where, as you mentioned, perception and our view of a situation could be one thing, and then we grow, we learn, we evolve, we change, and then we perhaps hold a different view about something. When you think about that aspect of life, the way that our perception does evolve with time, how do you think we can adapt effectively? Because I feel like that's one of the biggest challenges in any kind of relationship, any friendship, is when we grow and change and maybe that doesn't match the circumstances around us anymore.
Yeah. I'd be interested in your answer to that great question too. So for me, I say with huge humility in that. I think so I'm a fiercely loyal person, and I think any relationship where one person has grown or if there's growing apart, I think there can be great sadness in that. What I'm trying in my own personal life in my 40s is to accept that is natural, that at times there are relationships where one person grows and then the other, and you find your way back together. And there are other times when you just grow apart. And that even though that's sad, it's not a tragedy. And as my 6-year-old was saying to me about it the other day, he did a lesson at school, and he said, some friendships, he said, it's like the seasons. And, you're in summer or you're in spring, and then you go into winter, and then sometimes autumn, and then sometimes they die.
Yeah.
I thought, that's pretty philosophically rich coming from a 6-year-old.
Yeah.
But as someone who's been in a marriage for 28 years, and marriage is a verb, certainly there's been a cross-torsion when my husband has grown or I have grown. And then there's a twofold part of that, isn't it? One, you put your hand back to that other person and you say, come with me. But you also have to be at peace with bringing your arm back to your side, because it's not your job to pull anyone through their life and demand that of them. So I think there's some grace. I think there's some wisdom in it. I think there's a skill set, but I think there's also surrender.
And I think another part of what you do in your job of communication, that's probably a really significant part too. And like an honesty, I would think, in what viewpoints are shifting or what kind of growth is happening, or those sorts of transitional moments, I suppose, being able to talk about them effectively and being honest about them, I'm sure has to contribute to a relationship that stays healthy versus one that doesn't.
Absolutely. I completely agree with that. I mean, I had a situation personally fairly recently with my husband. I won't get into details that freak you all out, but it's been an issue that we've had sort of for over a decade. But basically we got to a point where we reattempted the conversation, and he could give his part, I could give my part. And it's not like this conversation was sponsored by Disney and, then everything was understood. But through that language and his language, we'd formed a scaffolding, I suppose, around this space, this issue. And just that took all the charge out of it. And I thought, that's so interesting. We're going to, I mean, obviously this is why I'm married to him and want to stay married to him, because I want to carry on the conversation and understand it better. But I think there's valiance in the attempt. And what I know through my work as a facilitator and my work with, being a facilitator for Brene Brown's work and positive psychology, is that the more curious you are about your life and your own blind spots, and the more you're able to be accountable and honest and self-aware, the better your life is, the more, the more powerful you are in the world, the more grounded confidence you have, but the better that you can love and be loved.
Yeah, it's so beautifully said. And I'm sure there's a sort of psychological side to some of the experiences we go through where we feel like we're, good people doing bad stuff, right? I think that's something that Odessa represents really interestingly in this kind of, what's the word, like de-evolution of
yeah, I love that.
Her kind of morality, where she sort of starts one way, and again, not to spoil anything for anybody, but you start to go, why is she making that choice in that particular way? I'm sure you wouldn't normally do that. From all of the work that you have done from that psychological side of things, what's your perspective on why sort of quote unquote good people do bad things?
Yeah. Good people do bad things all the time, and obviously it's a very complex idea and deeply fascinating. I love that idea, just jogging sideways, that none of us are the worst thing that we've ever done, nor are we the best thing we've ever done. That's not the sum of our parts. And I always get a bit nervous when people say, "Oh, I regret nothing. I regret nothing." And I think, wow. Because I love the idea, and it's not mine. I learned it somewhere along the line that we should feel grateful to our regrets, because it indicates that we've learnt and grown, and that if we knew better, we would have done better. I love that. If we knew better, we would have done better. But it's trauma. It's trauma that's propelling Odessa. And I think in my own life, when I've made bad decisions or what I see, I generally think people are not monsters. They're not evil. I think bad behavior comes from a broken heart, comes from trauma, comes from hurt. And the hurt is expressed often as rage, and we make destructive choices. If Odessa had been thinking better, had her equilibrium, had been able to maybe pop herself into therapy, had been able to ask for help, which is a problem that she has as a perfectionist and as someone with control freak tendencies, I don't think that her rage and her hurt would have poured out in those behaviors. Because as you've alluded to, I think she's a good person. I think she's a great, interesting, brilliant woman who makes some really bad choices that are fueled by her pain.
And I'm glad you touched on that, because in the way that Odessa deals with things, certainly she does spiral, and it makes for a great novel, right? This is a great read because of some of these things that happen in Odessa's life. But when we talk a bigger picture about the rage that many females can have, and not all, again, that is a generalization, but there's a lot of justifiable things that mean women may feel overlooked or feel unheard, or just have that sense of, I want to use my voice and I don't know how. From your perspective, I mean, you're a mum of 2 daughters as well. What would your advice be on how to address rage, use our voice in really healthy, non-divisive ways?
So the book Good and Mad by Rebecca Traister, it changed my life. It made me realize why I was resentful so much, because I wasn't expressing my anger. And look, let's be super clear. We're talking about good, healthy anger here, because there's obviously toxic, bad anger. I mean, you don't want to live in anger. I'm not talking about over-identifying with any feeling, particularly anger. But anger, healthy anger that can be harnessed and understood, which requires calling it by its name and not suppressing it, because resentment is suppressed anger. So, I used to have a PhD in repressed anger. I was just resenting all the time. And in a way, I'd done a sort of spiritual bypass, because I thought, I don't want to feel anger. I'm not that person. I don't want to be out of control. I don't want to alienate people. I don't want to be cast out. I don't want to be unlovable. So I would just resent instead. And madness. And I love that adage that resentment is the poison that you drink and then you wait for your enemy to die.
Yeah.
You know, so it's just resentment is a toxicity that you bury in the center of yourself. So for me, that thing of looking at my anger and going, okay, looking at it, calling it by its name, and then going, is this rational or not? And the really interesting thing for me, so I realize I'm answering this in a kind of roundabout way, but the interesting thing for me was when I looked at my anger and went, is this rational or not? It was often I could look back in time and go, I didn't call a boundary, and that's why I'm angry. That's why I'm angry. If I'd said, I don't want this, or I don't like that, or I can't do this, I can't give you that, then I wouldn't have been angry. So what I talk to my kids about, male and female, is boundaries, asking themselves, is this okay for me or not okay for me? Do I want this or do I not want this? And then expressing it clearly, because other human beings are not mind readers.
Yeah.
So I think it's that. And what I say to my girls, particularly because they're teens, and I say this to my sons, but they're littler, they're 11 and 6, is, use your anger to propel you forwards, but don't live inside it. And righteous outrage feels great, but it's harmful, and Odessa, she certainly slips into a massive ocean of righteous outrage. And, we all know that thing of feeling morally superior. But, righteous outrage, bad. Yeah. But healthy anger that propels you for change, for growth, for self-understanding, for reckoning. I mean, look at Greta Thunberg. There is rage that's been harnessed. When my daughter slams a door off the hinges, not healthy rage. So we go back to, okay, express your emotions. And often rage is a masking emotion. There's something that sits underneath it. And I know for me, often when I'm enraged, when I really look at it, what's sitting underneath for me often is fear or overwhelm. And just tracing that back myself, it means that I take the charge out of the rage and then I can address with what is actually going on with me, rather than behaving badly, shouting at people or resenting and getting sick.
Yeah, there's certainly a lesson in being able to articulate what's going on for you and say, communicate your boundaries and that sort of thing. And I think that takes a level of confidence that maybe not all of us have. Certainly some of the female characters within the Dangers of Female Provocation, your book, they don't know how to say what they do and don't accept, or will and won't accept. If you're that person who feels like you are struggling to articulate or struggling to put healthy boundaries around you, how do you get better at becoming more confident to do that?
Well, that was me. I mean, I didn't know what boundaries were until I was in my 20s. I just didn't know what they were. I certainly didn't have it role modeled in my childhood. So, this is the exciting thing about being alive, isn't it? That we constantly get to learn and grow. So, I married someone with amazingly good boundaries, and I realized in retrospect that I did that as a proxy. He could do the boundaries of our lives, and I could just carry on not really understanding them. So it was actually when I had my first child, my mother had died, when I had my first child, looking at my own life and going, there's a skill set that's missing here. This is a real blind spot for me. I need to look into this. So it was asking buddies about boundaries. And interestingly, I have a lot of my dearest friends have really good boundaries because I was very drawn to that. So they could do it rather than me. But so saying to them, how do you do it? What does it look like? And it just sounded terrifying to me in the beginning. And then trying in the shallows, not jumping in the deep end with someone who really freaks you out. Starting in the shallows with a really easy situation, maybe with a best friend who asks you out on a Thursday night and you actually know that you need to stay at home and go to sleep early, and just being honest and saying, I really want to see you, but I'm tired. Can we do it the week after? And then, what's amazing when you're just honest and call a boundary, people respect it. And they feel respected too, that you're honest with them. So someone once said to me years ago, look, Zoe, you can't say a yes unless you can say a no. And it took me about 5 or 6 years of thinking to work out what on earth that meant.
Yeah.
then realizing it's totally true. And here's the thing. Now I'm really good at boundaries. I'm not excellent. It's going to be a lifelong thing for me because I've had to burn a lot of new neural pathways. But at least I can stop in that micro moment and go, okay, let's just check in. And do I want this? And actually, if I don't, I'm going to need to say it and say it right now.
Yeah, and it sounds like, as I listen to you, that the very overused cliche for authors to write what you know, that has been true for you in the way you've written this book and in your previous ones as well.
Well, I don't know how you write what you don't know. That idea to me, I mean, I certainly, they used to say at acting school that when you're acting, you can act a character that is less knowledgeable than yourself, less well-rounded, but you can't act someone more rounded, more brilliant, more interesting. And I think that makes sense of writing as well. And also, I don't know that I would like to read a book where someone is pretending to understand spaces and ideas that they don't know. That said, great writers, great creatives can ask the beautiful question. And that doesn't mean that they necessarily know the answer. So I certainly have plenty of questions in this life that I don't have the answers for. But I think looking at the questions and holding the questions and examining them is really interesting and worthy and fun.
And you've got a gift of writing your way, telling stories, through some of those big questions. And I think it's really admirable as we look at your career as someone who has acted, as we've said. You're obviously writing, you do the communication side of things. You've been able to transition and kind of adapt to each of those different things. How have you known when to embark on the new project, the new interest, the new facet of what you want to be, working on in life?
Well, as we've sort of touched on before, the evolution of life itself just helps with that. So, for example, my acting career was never flourished in a way that I wanted it to and was never compatible with the kind of life I wanted to lead. So for me, I got out of drama school at 21 and I put a line in the sand of 27, 28. And it was just, if this isn't sustaining me on all levels or on enough levels, I'm going to move on, because I'd met so many creatives who'd held on and held on and held on, and then were resentful and sad and bitter and cynical and jealous, so jealous of other people's success. So there was that. There was also I became pregnant with my first child. So I knew that I needed to make a shift. And also my mother had died, and the type of acting jobs that I was getting weren't nourishing me, weren't making me feel a sense of meaning or purpose in my life. I was wearing tiny little outfits and push-up bras running around in the jungle. That's acting, not on my weekend.
Yeah.
And, when you're away from home for weeks on end doing that sort of stuff, it's like, God, this is not what I want to do with my life. This doesn't make me feel whole. And so that's when I started volunteering in hospices and working with homeless people. And then I was like, okay, here is a thread to something that is really meaningful for me. And that's when I got into, and also that evolved into acting teaching and corporate training. And then the writing has been something I've always wanted to do. And in all honesty, just wasn't really brave enough for a long time because, as I said, I grew up in a household with a lot of books, and I had a really strong sense of what great art was, in my opinion, and I just felt I would fall terribly short. And here's one of the great things about getting older that I don't think people talk about enough is, as you get older, you're just like, I got to get out of my own way, and that's just fear. And if I don't make the attempt, to use the cliche, I'm going to regret this at the end of my life. So it was turning 40. Having had my 4 babies, having worked throughout that time, loving the corporate training, loving the keynotes, loving the small piece of writing I was doing, and then going, all right, let's do this. And I started at my 40th and went, I'm going to have the first draft by the time I'm 41.
Wow.
And I did. And I had a contract by the time I was 42 with Ultimo Press for a 2-book deal.
Yeah.
So it's just that thing of, living a courageous life, which is terrifying. And I always used to think, I just need to get over the fear and then I'll be courageous. And then through, say, my work with Brene Brown and lots of other people realizing, oh, no, courageous people feel afraid and they just do it anyway. So
right.
I'm going, all right, well, I'm going to white knuckle it. Here I go.
Yep. Bravely into the future.
That's right.
Which brings me to a question that I ask pretty much all of our guests. Always love to. The title of this podcast is Undistracted. We learn from you, our guests, how to live our lives in line with our passions, our purpose, dealing with some of the stuff that gets in the way. If you were to live totally undistracted in pursuit of the things that, set you on fire, what would that look like for you?
Oh, I love that question. It's so interesting. I think the answer is self-awareness, self-compassion, and courage. And if that all sounds very self, I mean to reckon with those things so then you can actually spend your time in awe at the world and at people. Because I find when I get snared up in my own sort of self-loathing or judgment of myself or of other people, those sort of small, mean emotions, which are just connected to not enoughness or fear, then I feel like I'm living a half-life, and it sort of gets narcissistic, and you get in that horrible shame spiral. So basically I'm talking about being more evolved. So doing the work so that you can feel comfortable in your own skin and then be in a place of gratitude and wonder with the world and be open to delight and joy and awe. I'm thinking about awe and hope a lot more since COVID, that idea that those ideas that need to be cultivated and looked for.
Yeah, you've answered that beautifully. I love your perspective, Zoe. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat to us. I really appreciate it.
Oh, my great pleasure. Thank you for such great questions. It's gorgeous talking to you.
Zoe's answer definitely goes down as one of my favourites. I hope you appreciated this conversation. A reminder, if you choose to read her book, The Dangers of Female Provocation, it is a mature read. There are some big themes as it talks about trauma, betrayal, intimacy. So tread carefully, but know that if you do, the character of Odessa is one that prompts some pretty big questions. You can subscribe to this podcast, rate it, review it wherever you're listening. And until next time, enjoy living this undistracted life.
This is a Hope 1032 production. Thanks for listening.